Hello, everyone. Welcome to another book review, something that I'm very new at. But today is Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I was first introduced to this book in a freshman year English class called Do the Right Thing. And so the first time that I read this book, it was very much under the lens of morality. What is right? What is wrong? What does it mean to sin? What does it mean to find grace? And certainly, religion and ethics were a huge part of my first time reading this book. And I think those are all valid ways to approach this book. But I will say that for me, reading this the second time, I had a really different take on what this book could offer. And so hopefully, my thoughts today are a little bit off the beaten path in some regards. And I'll talk a little bit about the philosophy of this book and sort of how it builds on the sort of Nietzschean framework that Dostoevsky comes from. Um, so the first thing that I'll say is that I'm reading the Pevear and Volokhonsky translation. My freshman year English professor was one who would swear by this translation. I haven't read Crime and Punishment in any other translation, so I can't speak on it, but I can recommend this translation. I've heard that they tend to bring a very literalist approach to all of their translations of Dostoevsky's work. And I think potentially there is some sacrifice that occurs there when you lose out on all of these sort of interior psychological elements that this book is often sort of renowned for. But I had a great time reading their translation. I think it is dense but accessible. And at the very end, I'll talk about why it's my favorite translation out of any sort of translation of Dostoevsky's work that I have read, from the Brothers Karamazov to Notes from Underground to White Nights. I really like this specific translation of Crime and Punishment. It holds a sort of specific spot in my heart. Um, I'll start off by saying that I think the title is a bit of a misnomer. So, front and center here we have crime and punishment. And in some senses, I'll sort of talk about this later, it is offering an action and then a reaction. Um, just to be contrarian for a little bit, I would say that my revision to the title would be to remove the word crime um, and just have the book be called And Punishment. Because really, to me, it is about the torment and the torture that is inherent to human existence and human consciousness. And that's why I think that word and does so much heavy lifting, right? There's the sort of innate state of existence, and then there's punishment. So that's sort of one thing that I like to tell people is that I think the book should be called And Punishment. Um, that sort of leads me into a larger point, which is that the advertisement and the sort of social perceptions around this book, I think, are often off center, especially for those who have never read the book before. So if you're someone who's never read Crime and Punishment before, you'll often look on the back, and I have to say, as much as I like this copy, the back of this book is atrocious. They start by saying, "It is a murder story told from a murderer's point of view. It is a cat and mouse game between a tormented young killer and a cheerfully implacable detective." And I can't tell you how wrong those descriptions are. Those descriptions are meant to sell you on something that this book is not. It's not a murder story. It's not a detective story. Um, and it's not even a cat and mouse story. I would argue that in this book, the cat character doesn't come until much later, and that the sort of detective and main character are more engaged in the dynamic of being two mice, is how I would sort of describe that dynamic. Um, but that brings us to the question, well, what is this book really about then, right? So broad strokes, you spend around 80 pages getting to the titular crime, and it's not really a spoiler to say that the main character kills an old pawnbroker, because that's what people know this book for. So 80 pages getting to that sort of inciting incident, and then the next 500 pages are about Raskolnikov, who is a young and poor law student in Moscow, trying to sort of internally understand why he committed that crime, and why, in the wake of committing that crime, the world, or I should say specifically his world, feels as if it begins to deteriorate. And so this goes back to what I was saying about action and reaction. That's what this book is about. Um, it is concerned about the interface between the body and the mind. So how do we go from swinging an axe over our head at an innocent old lady, to all of these psychological things that happen in our brain afterwards, and then how do we go back to the physical level? How does the psyche affect our bodily processes? And I feel like that's something that really is not talked about enough with this book, which is that it is a really intensely visceral experience. And I'm using that word really intentionally here in regards to what it means when I say viscera. I'm talking about our internal organs, our internal processes. These are things that become really forefronted in this book, and that's something that Dostoevsky, as a philosopher, is really singular on. You don't find a lot of philosophers that are able to bridge that gap between the psychological and the somatic, and that's something that I'll talk about a little bit more. But I just want to leave that there for you to think about. So in terms of experience, the experience reading the book, it's not as hard as you might think. I think Dostoevsky can be really scary. It certainly was scary for me when I first thought about having to read this book for a class. I thought, I don't know anything about Russian culture. He's one of the most prominent Russian writers of our time, and you have people who study their whole lives in Russian to be able to understand all of the nuances of this book. So how am I supposed to really enter this and feel that I have had a good experience reading it? I'll say that I'm probably missing a lot when I read this book, but I don't think you need to know a lot about Russian culture to get the most out of this book. The only thing that is difficult about reading Dostoevsky, especially this book, is the nomenclature. So if you're not familiar, and certainly I wasn't, I guess Russian people or Dostoevsky love to use 20 different names to describe the same person. And so the main character is Raskolnikov, but his full name is Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov. So sometimes he goes by Rodion, or sometimes he'll go by Rodion Romanovich. Sometimes he goes by Raskolnikov, obviously. Sometimes he goes by Rodia, and then sometimes they like to throw K's in there, so they call him Rodka or Rodionka. And so it's really disorienting to read that. At sometimes you have to keep a little bit of a tally. He's easy enough because all of his three names start with R, so if you see someone who has an R, it's probably him. But then you get to characters like Sonia and Porfiry, and it just becomes really hard to keep track of who is in the room at any given time. But that's sort of a small thing. You can very easily get past that. And if you're any smarter than me, you'll have no trouble doing that. The bulk of this time I want to spend talking about Nietzsche. So it's no secret to anyone that reads this book that Dostoevsky is very much in conversation with Nietzsche's writing, particularly what he has to say about the concept of the Übermensch, or the Superman. So this concept of the Nietzschean Superman is something that sort of recurs over and over in the book, at times very obliquely, and then at times you sort of feel Dostoevsky looking up from the page at you and saying, okay, pull out your notebook, I'm going to lecture you about the Übermensch, right? So one of the big questions when someone comes and they say, well, why should I read Crime and Punishment, has to do with how philosophical it is and how much of a dialogue it is with Nietzsche's philosophy. So again, that big question is, why would I read this book when I can go read the source material? What does Dostoevsky say about this philosophy, about the Übermensch, that is original? So my take on that, and I think that this is something that Dostoevsky is very aware of, is that Nietzsche is not someone who is dramatic. And I don't mean that in the sense that he wasn't entertaining, or he didn't wave around these big ideas. Obviously he did. I mean that at his heart, Nietzsche is a scientist. He is an instructor. He argued. He had a thesis. And I really don't think that that is the sort of tradition that Dostoevsky comes from. So Crime and Punishment, you'll read it, and it does not have a clear takeaway. At least for most of the book, it doesn't. So I think you have to go to great lengths, or you can go to great lengths, to talk about what exactly the punishment is for the crime. And I think that's what makes this book so fascinating to read over and over, is that it's such an opaque punishment, right? So under a Nietzschean framework, we might say that Raskolnikov is punished by his ultimate discovery and acceptance that he is not an Übermensch, that he is not superior. So the converse being that the punishment, inferiority is the punishment. But that's not what Dostoevsky argues. So Dostoevsky essentially argues to me that the concept, as Nietzsche offers it, of the Übermensch is failed. It is tried and it is failed. Our attempts to become superior, to reach something above, or to add this missing piece to our lives or to our identity is actually something that subtracts from the experience of life. It subtracts joy from our lives. And so many people describe this novel as terribly bleak, nihilistic, apocalyptic, whatever you want to say. But if you take one thing from my review of this, it's to sort of go into this book, reading it under the lens that it might offer you something hopeful and motivational. So Raskolnikov wastes his entire life away by the end of this book. He loses everything. And that's not a spoiler to say that. It's really not. You lose nothing by me telling you that. But he does lose everything by the end of this book. He gives everything up. He forfeits everything that makes him him. But at the end of that tunnel, especially in the epilogue of the book, he learns a lesson that is so incredibly bright. And it takes him, again, losing everything and going to the deepest, pits of his own identity to learn that one lesson. And you, the reader, get to learn that lesson in just 600 pages, right? So in 600 pages, you get a lesson that is worth someone's entire life. And that's the beauty of this book. So really go into this book thinking about what it can teach you about life. Don't go into it as this voyeuristic experience where you get to laugh at someone who's losing everything. One more thing that I want to talk about that separates Dostoevsky from Nietzsche, and I talked about this earlier, but it's the level of somatic detail that's added here. So when you read Nietzsche, even if you read some of his more narrative works like Zarathustra, he tends to still focus on these abstract psychological concepts like will and triumph. These are things that you can't hold and that become confined to essentially the classroom. And this is what I mean when I say that Nietzsche is someone who lectures. Now, when you read Crime and Punishment or you read Dostoevsky, these concepts are incarnated. They're given flesh, and they're given form. And I read this book recently. I've been sick, if you can't hear it, for the past week or so. And you feel this book on a physiological level like no other. So instead of thinking of just what it means to have willpower, you think about what it means to subsist, what it means to survive on the most basal carnal level, what it means to exist and have your heart beat and have your intestines work. When you take a concept like triumph, it is not just this abstract, psychological concept. Triumph becomes physical nourishment, becomes a state of health, a state of well-being. And so these are the sort of lateral translations that occur when you read Crime and Punishment. So again, I read this book and I'm reading, Pevear and Volokhonsky's translation from the original Russian. But you're also reading philosophers in conversation. You're reading Dostoevsky translating concepts into the flesh. And that's something that's really magical about this book. So those are my broad takeaways, and I'll sort of end, as I usually do, by just sort of reading one of my favorite passages to sort of give you a small idea of why I like the writing of this book so much. Again, it's not the most poetic language, but my favorite passage from this entire book, and arguably from literature at large, is a dream sequence, one of many key dream sequences in this book, where Raskolnikov dreams of himself as this young boy, and he's witnessing this event in the town square where all of these cruel people begin beating and maiming this innocent horse who doesn't seem to be moving. So I'll sort of read it, and then I'll go over why I think this quote is so important to think of before you read Crime and Punishment. "Finish her off," shouted Mikolka, and he leapt beside himself out of the cart. Several young men, also flushed with drink, seized anything that they could come across, whips, sticks, poles, and ran to the dying mare. Mikolka stood on one side and began dealing random blows with the crowbar. The mare stretched out her head, drew a long breath, and died. "You butchered her," someone shouted in the crowd. "Why wouldn't she gallop then?" "My property," shouted Mikolka with bloodshot eyes, brandishing the bar in his hands. He stood as though regretting that he had nothing more to beat. "No mistake about it, you are not a Christian," many voices were shouting in the crowd. But the poor boy, beside himself, made his way screaming through the crowd to the sorrel nag, put his arms around her bleeding dead head and kissed it, kissed the eyes and kissed the lips. Then he jumped up and flew in a frenzy with his little fists out at Mikolka. At that instant, his father, who had been running after him, snatched him up and carried him out of the crowd. And so the reason that I bring this quote to you all is that it offers this terribly cold moment where a young boy is being traumatized and he is, learning for the first time what it means to be cruel. There's a scene of intense violence, and then there's a scene of intense somatic compassion, where the head is bleeding out, but it is, being kissed on the lips at the same time. And then you see this boy who is just learning what it means to love and just learning what it means to feel anger and hatred. He gets up with his, as they describe it, his little fists, right? And he flies out in a frenzy. And there's this just beautiful intertwinement between, again, the body and the mind, what it means to love and what it means to hate. And ultimately, the reason I think this is so important is because it recontextualizes what we think of violence. So again, when you see this book and you see them advertise it as a crime, the world tells you it's a crime to be violent, right? It is a crime to raise your axe above your head and slaughter an old lady. What this scene tells us is that there's more to it than just a crime. To be violent is an indicator of something. We are violent for a reason. And if you just take this, the very end of the sequence in isolation and say, okay, there's a young boy who raises little fists at another man, you label him as violent and you label him as immature. But when you read this dream in a larger context, you understand that it's not immaturity. It's actually the highest level of maturity, right? And that's what Dostoevsky is offering you. He argues that there's more to violence than meets the eye. When you read this book, you have to understand what it means to be violent and why Raskolnikov chooses to be violent. And again, by the end of the book, if you read it, going into this book, if you go into this book with an open perspective, and if you go into this book looking for the silver lining, looking for these small shards of warmth that we can find in an otherwise incredibly cold world, you will learn a lesson at the end that is very similar to the lesson that Raskolnikov learns in this scene with the horse, which is that, I'll leave the full lesson for you to discover on your own, but you learn that there's more to violence and more to compassion than you were perhaps aware of at the start of the novel. So that's what I have to say about this book. If you made it all the way, then thank you. And I encourage you to read it. And for my very insignificant rating of this book, I think I would give it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. So have a good day.